All right, so have you ever thought about what happens when the government decides it needs your land? Like, what if your family's property, the one that's been passed down for generations, suddenly becomes essential for some big national project?
Mm.
The government offers what they consider a fair price, but you think, wait a minute, this is way too low. What can you do? What even determines a fair price in these situations, legally speaking?
That's a really good question. And honestly, a situation a lot more people than you'd think might find themselves in.
Exactly. It's actually at the center of this really interesting legal battle that made it all the way to the Philippine Supreme Court. And that's what we're going to be dissecting today.
I think this one's going to be pretty fascinating.
So to break it down, we're diving deep into a Supreme Court decision about just compensation for land that gets acquired under the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program.
Right, CARP. And the case we're looking at is Land Bank of the Philippines versus Corazon and Villegas.
GR 224760, decided on October 6th, 2021.
So let's jump right into it.
Okay, so first things first. Who is this Corazon Villegas, and what was going on with her property?
Well, Corazon and Villegas owned this piece of land, like a pretty good-sized one, about 11.7 hectares in Negros Occidental. And back in 2003, she actually volunteered to sell a chunk of it, about 10.6 hectares, to the government under CARP's voluntary offer to sell scheme.
So VOS, they have all these acronyms.
Right, VOS. So just to be clear, it wasn't like the government was forcing her to sell. She made the initial offer.
She offered it to them. So where did things go wrong?
Well, the Land Bank of the Philippines, they're the ones who handle the money side of CRAP. They looked at those 10.6 hectares and said, okay, we think it's worth about 580,000 pesos.
580,000.
Yeah, and Ms. Vegas was like, nope, not happening. That's way too low. So she rejected their offer. But here's the thing. Even though she said no, they went ahead and deposited that 580,000 pesos into her bank account anyway.
Really? It sounds a little bit pushy, doesn't it? Like, here's the money, whether you like it or not. So what did she do after she rejected their valuation? I mean, did she just give up or?
Oh, no, not at all. So the case went to the Provincial Agrarian Reform Adjudicator, PARAD.
Another acronym.
Right. They basically had this administrative hearing to figure out a fair price for the land. And you wouldn't believe it, but the PARAD sided with the land bank. They said, yeah, 580,000 pesos seems about right.
Oh, wow. So she raises an objection, and then the PARAD is like, nope, we agree with the land bank. I bet that was pretty frustrating for her.
Yeah, I imagine it was. But Ms. Villegas wasn't giving up that easily. She appealed the PARAD's decision to the Department of Agrarian Reform Adjudication Board. That's the DARAB.
DARAB. Okay, got it. So did the DARAB see things her way?
Well, finally, she caught a break. The DARAB decided that the land was worth way more than the initial valuation and bumped it up to, get this, about 1.8 million pesos.
1.8 million. Okay, so that's a pretty big jump from the original 580,000. But I mean, even then, she might have still felt like it wasn't quite enough, like not truly just compensation. So where did the case go from there?
Okay, so the land bank, they weren't too happy with this higher price tag. They figured, okay, let's take this to court. So they filed a case with the regional trial court, but it was acting as a special agrarian court.
We'll just say RTC. Easier to remember.
Exactly, RTC. Now, this move brought the whole dispute into the judicial system, with judges and lawyers and everything. It was getting serious.
So now we've got the RTC involved. What did they do to try and settle this issue of just compensation?
All right, so what the RTC did is actually pretty common in these kinds of cases. They decided we need a neutral expert opinion. So they formed a board of commissioners.
A board of commissioners?
Yeah, these are basically people who are supposed to be unbiased. They know a lot about land valuation, and their job is to go and take a look at the property, come up with a value, and then report back to the court with their findings.
So it's like getting a second opinion, or maybe even a third or fourth, from people who really know their stuff. Okay, so this board goes out there, they crunch some numbers, and what do they come back with? What did they think the land was worth?
Well, they used the formula that's laid out in Department of Agrarian Reform Administrative Order number 5.
Yeah.
DAO number 5 for short.
DAO no 5.
Right. This formula, it basically tries to take everything into account, the income the land could generate, the market value based on similar properties, stuff like that. And the interesting thing is the Board of Commissioners actually came up with 2 different possible values.
2 different values.
Yeah, one was around 1.83 million pesos, which was pretty close to what the DRAB had decided.
Okay, so pretty similar.
But the other value they came up with was way higher, something like 2.94 million pesos.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge difference. What made them think there were two possible values, and why did they end up recommending the much higher one?
Good questions. The main reason for the difference boiled down to how they calculated the selling price of the crops that were grown on the land, primarily sugar and corn, since we're talking about Negros Occidental. For the lower valuation, they used average selling prices from back around 2003-2004, when Miss Villegas initially offered the land.
Makes sense. That was the time frame.
But for that higher valuation, they used the average selling prices all the way up to the 2010-2011 crop year.
So like 6 or 7 years later, why did they do that?
Well, their argument was that the prices of sugar and molasses had gone up significantly during those later years, and they felt like using those later prices would more accurately reflect the true value of the land in the current market.
So they were saying, look, things have changed, the prices are way higher now, the land is worth more. Interesting strategy. What did the RTC think about all of this? Did they buy it?
They did. The RTCSE ended up siding with the Board of Commissioners and that higher recommendation, setting the just compensation at about 2.94 million pesos. They said this amount took all the relevant factors from the comprehensive agrarian reform law into account, and it was a fair deal for both sides.
I see. So at this point, it seems like Miss Villegas is winning this whole thing. She gets a much higher price for her land than the land bank originally offered.
Right, but it's important to remember that the legal process can be pretty long and winding. It's not over till it's over.
Oh, I bet. So did the land bank accept this decision, or did they keep fighting?
Oh, they definitely weren't done yet. Remember how I said the legal process can be a long road?
Right, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Exactly. So the land bank appealed the RTCCSE's decision, taking the case up to the Court of Appeals.
So round two, what happened there?
And get this, the Court of Appeals actually sided with the RTCSEC. They agreed with the 2.94 million pesos in just compensation.
Wow, okay, so the land bank loses again. I guess at this point, there's only one place left to go, right? The Supreme Court.
You got it, the Supreme Court, the big leagues.
So what was the main issue that the Supreme Court had to decide on? What was the big question in front of them?
All right, so the real crux of the matter for the Supreme Court was whether the lower courts, the RTCSAC and the Court of Appeals, got it wrong when they set that just compensation amount at 2.94 million.
Okay, so it all boils down to that number.
Yeah, and the land bank, their main argument was that those lower courts didn't use the guidelines from DO No. 5 correctly. They were basically saying, hey, there's a formula, there are rules, and they didn't follow them properly.
So the land bank is saying the lower courts didn't do their math right. All right, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did the Supreme Court decide? Who won?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The Supreme Court actually agreed with the land bank, but only partially. Yeah, it's not a complete victory for either side. So the court reiterated that at the end of the day, it's the courts that are responsible for figuring out what just compensation is.
Okay, so the courts have the final say.
Exactly. But they also stressed that the RTCSCC has to consider the factors that are laid out in the law, specifically Section 17 of the CARP law.
Makes sense. They can't just make up their own rules.
And those factors from Section 17 are actually translated into a specific formula in, you guessed it, DAO Note 5.
That DAO Note 5 keeps coming back.
Right. It's really important in these kinds of cases. Anyway, in Ms. Villegas' case, there wasn't enough data to use the comparable sales part of the formula, so the court had to use a slightly different calculation. Land value equals capitalized net income times 0.9 plus market value times 0.1.
Okay, so there's a whole mathematical formula involved. I'm starting to see why this got so complicated, but the Supreme Court said the lower courts maybe didn't use this formula correctly.
That's exactly it. The Supreme Court was basically saying, look, judges can sometimes deviate from the formula, but if they do, they better have a really good reason.
Show your work, basically. So, what specific mistakes did the Supreme Court find in how the lower courts applied this formula? Where did they go wrong?
They messed up in a couple of key areas. First, when it came to calculating the market value, the Board of Commissioners had used the total area of Mrs. Villegas' land, all 11.7 hectares.
Right, that was the total.
But they should have only used the portion that was actually being acquired under CRP, which was about 10.6 hectares.
Ah, so they were overestimating the land area.
Exactly. So the Supreme Court corrected that mistake. They used the right area, and they also made sure to take into account the fact that part of the land was sugar land, part was corn land, and that there were improvements like coconut and banana trees that added value. However, they did agree with using the 2004 Regional Consumer Price Index for calculations, because that's what DAO NEDM 5 says to use.
Makes sense. Follow the rules, unless there's a good reason not to.
Yeah.
Okay, so they fixed the market value calculation. What about that capitalized net income part? Did they find any problems there?
For capitalized net income, the Supreme Court agreed with how the lower courts used data from the local sugar mill about how much the land could produce, like the annual gross production for the 2003-2004 crop year and the net income rate. They weren't convinced by the land bank's objections to this data.
So far, so good.
But here's where the Supreme Court disagreed with the lower courts. They said it was wrong to use selling price data from beyond the 2003-2004 crop year,
Why?
because they were adamant that just compensation has to be based on the value of the property at the time the government decided to take it.
Which was back in 2004.
Exactly. Using selling prices from all the way up to 2011, like the Board of Commissioners did for that higher valuation, was basically taking future price increases into account. The Supreme Court said, nope, that's not how it works. The interest that gets awarded is meant to compensate for any delay in payment, but you can't just keep increasing the purchase price based on how the market changes over time.
Right, that wouldn't be fair. Okay, so the Supreme Court basically said, back to the drawing board, use the correct formula, the correct land area, and the correct time frame. With all those corrections in place, what was the final amount of just compensation? What did Mrs. Villegas actually end up getting for her land?
So, after all the adjustments, the Supreme Court set the just compensation at 1,935,776.40 pesos.
1,935,776.40, still a lot more than that initial offer, but less than the 2.94 million that the lower courts had decided on. What about the interest on this amount? Did she get any interest on top of that?
Yeah, the Supreme Court upheld the decision to award her legal interest on the unpaid balance, and the interest rate was set at 12% per year, starting from the date of taking, which was September 29, 2004, and running until June 30, 2013.
12% interest is not bad.
Right. And then from July 1st, 2013 until the full payment is made, the interest rate changes to 6% per year. That's based on guidelines from Banco Central, the Filipino Circular Number 799.
Lots of numbers, lots of dates, lots of rules and regulations. But it sounds like after a long and complicated legal battle, the Supreme Court finally figured out what just compensation meant in this specific case.
Definitely a long road.
In this whole case, it really brings up some important legal principles, right? Like, what are the big takeaways, the key doctrines that this ruling reinforces? I mean, what should people remember about just compensation?
Oh, absolutely. There are some really fundamental legal concepts at play here. First off, there's the idea of just compensation itself, which basically means that when the government takes your property, they have to pay you a fair price for it, a price that truly reflects what it's worth, not just any random number they come up with.
Right, it has to be fair, not just convenient for the government.
Exactly. And another important concept highlighted here is judicial determination of just compensation. So even though you have other groups involved, like the Perad and the Darab, who give their opinions on what the land is worth, ultimately it's the courts that have the final say in determining that just price. They get to decide.
It's like checks and balances, right? Everyone plays a role, but ultimately the courts get to make the final call.
Makes sense.
What else should people keep in mind? I mean, this is obviously a pretty complex topic.
Well, this case also emphasizes how important it is to follow the rules. The Supreme Court stressed that courts really need to consider those factors and formulas that are in the CARP law and DAO No. 5 when they're trying to figure out just compensation. They can't just ignore them. And if they do decide to go against those rules, you've got to have a really solid reason for doing so.
So it's not a free-for-all. There's a framework in place.
Exactly. And then there's that whole issue of the time of taking. You have to go back to that specific point in time when the government first initiated the acquisition and based the valuation on the property's worth at that moment, not years later when the market might have gone up or down.
So it's like taking a snapshot of the market at a specific point in time.
That's a great way to put it. And lastly, remember that the legal interest that gets awarded, that's not just some bonus. It's meant to be damages for the delay in payment. It's basically saying, hey, the landowner should have had this money a while ago, so they're entitled to this interest to make up for the wait.
Makes sense. So it's not just about the principal amount. It's also about making sure the landowner is compensated fairly for the time they had to wait.
Yeah, time value of money and all that.
This case really shows how tricky things can get when the government needs private land for public projects. Like, it's this balancing act between making sure things like agrarian reform can happen while also upholding people's right to get a fair price for their property.
Absolutely, it's not easy.
It makes you think,
Yeah.
what does just compensation really mean? Is it just about plugging numbers into a formula, or is there more to it than that? Is it about making sure the landowner isn't left in a worse position than they were before? Is it about fairness and equity in the whole process of land reform? It's definitely something to ponder. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
And if you found this deep dive informative, hit that favorite button so we know to keep bringing you more cases like this.
And for more deep dives into the legal world and the forces shaping our society, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive.
We're all about bringing you clarity, understanding, and maybe even a little bit of legal wisdom, one case at a time.
One case